and seemed sort of clinically interested in it, and then who later became extremely hostile towards me. He was very hostile after I was being tortured and my son was being tortured, full-blown torture. And there was a nurse there who was a little bit shaky, a little bit worried, and she offered a suggestion, very just kind of backing off, but said, maybe, I said I'd tried everything else and he wouldn't give me any narcotics. And he knew that that was the only thing that treated my pain. So he was refusing to treat me, and with what worked, which you know, if you're treating somebody with something that doesn't work for the patient, that's not reasonable care or treatment. I mean, I could go in with a migraine, you could give me a popsicle, and thanks, you can write that up in the chart, but that's not going to be treatment any more than, you know, you're giving me sugar water in a shot is a treatment, even if it's not reasonable care. So this nurse said, what about Caprigot? It's an older kind of thing, but it might help with the inflammation or whatever. And he just shook his head no. He didn't want me to have Caprigot. I'd never even tried it, and I was open to trying it, and I nodded my head yes that I wanted to try it. And he said no. And I remember thinking, that's really weird. He doesn't want to treat me with narcotics, but he's not even willing to try something like Caprigot, which is not expensive, and it might work. So he was very, very rude and mean and vicious at that visit. And my entire opinion of Dr. Crane changed from that point on. So then I was over in Canada, and I guess ergotamine kind of works like Caprigot. It's different. It is different, but it sort of works in the same way. And when they gave it to me, they said that they had to give me what's called Gravel with it. And I think it's an antiemetic, something to keep you from throwing up. So it was 3 different things, but it was like ergotamine, this thing called Gravel, and maybe it was like just a regular IV solution. I mean, I've written about it before, but I have sort of forgotten everything that was in that. At any rate, right after they gave that to me, I think it was a reaction to having been cooked for such a long time with my son at our house, and my insides were cooked, and I felt the searing pain throughout my entire abdomen, and it was like everything went right into my system, and then all of a sudden it was as if I had someone lasering off the lining of my entire stomach. But it was a chemical reaction instead. And I said I had to use the restroom, and I went to the restroom. It was extreme pain. And then when I told them, they said that's not a usual reaction to this at all. And I know that the only reason I would have that kind of reaction is because of the kind of torture we were under, and the reaction my body had to it. The combination of being tortured, then removing ourselves from that high intensity torture, and then being given this different treatment. And so I went to the restroom, and when I went potty or whatever, there was like a massive amount of white colored tissue in the toilet. Not toilet tissue. It was body tissue, and it was white. It was solid white. It was blanched white, and I thought, it did not even look like, I mean, most of the time you look at your skin and tissue, and it's a off-white color, or maybe slightly pinkish, or has some sort of a color to it. This was solid white tissue that was coming out of my body. It almost, I can't exactly guess at what happened to my body, but all I know is I had this searing pain through the lining of my entire stomach, And then all of a sudden, I'm discharging all of this blanched white tissue. It was like I'd been in some sort of a chemical cauterization. Or I don't know how to describe it. I just thought, oh my gosh. And I left it there. I was like, of course I was not going to flush it because I had to show the nurse because that had never happened to me in my life. And she needed to see it. So I had her come in to see it. And she said, have you had a miscarriage? She said, were you pregnant? I said, no. And I was not with anybody intimately, hadn't been with anybody since my son was born. And, or before that too, a little bit. But I mean, definitely, since my son had been born, I hadn't dated and wasn't with anyone at all. There was no possible way for me to be pregnant. And yet I had just discharged this amount of tissue, white tissue. It was like this big of a blob in the toilet. And it was sort of, sheer in some parts, like as body tissue is. But, and I remember I felt it coming out. So, I don't know. I think that I used toilet tissue and wiped, but I didn't put it in the toilet because when I looked and saw what was in there, I didn't want to mix that up with what was there. I just knew that it was extremely bizarre and important for somebody to see. And it happened right after this really awful burning pain. But the other thing that happened is my migraine went away almost within 10 minutes. It went away right away, and I was very shocked because that was the only time I'd ever had any kind of non-narcotic treatment that really shut down the migraine sort of instantly. And later, when I had that same treatment, I never had that same burning reaction throughout the lining of my stomach. That never ever occurred again. I was able to get rid of my migraines with that kind of treatment with the ergotamine from that point forward, but I never once had this bizarre like passage of tissue and a burning sensation through my whole stomach. So it was almost like, I almost feel like, and I think I'm probably wrong because I'm not a doctor on this and I don't know all the effects of what was happening to my body. But it was almost like I'd been cooked. I was being cooked. So my son and I were being cooked, and it's almost like something inside my stomach and inside of my body became very inflamed and disrupted or something. And then with this particular chemical, it almost sheared off all of this. Who knows what it was like before the chemical thing, the chemical reaction. I don't know if I had tissue and my body was kind of falling apart and it was inflamed and it's just, you can imagine, like it was just very weird. So then after that happened, I went back to the bed with my son and I was about to leave and then they said, we need your personal information. So I gave them a different name than my own name, and that shouldn't have been a problem. But they already knew who I was, and they knew how to check on me. And all of a sudden they had, I gave it a fictitious name because I was going to ask for political asylum, and I didn't need to tell somebody immediately. I needed to know that I was in a safe place, and that I was in a safe spot to be able to ask for that political asylum. So far in Canada, I'd been tortured in Canada as well. So therefore, I was not exactly going to, ask somebody right there in that area where this is kind of still happening for help or assistance and declaring political asylum. I was pretty much thinking, I think I have to go to Toronto or just a different area maybe. And so then this police woman showed up And I didn't even know she was a policewoman when she came right up to the bed. I wasn't afraid or anything. She just came up and I didn't know who she was. And then she said, "You've given false information." She said, "You're going to be arrested." She said, "Do you know who I am? I'm an RCMP. And you gave false information. You're perverting justice, the course of justice, by giving a false name. And I'm going to have to take you in." And I could not believe it. I was shocked. And I said, I just didn't say anything. I told her, I tried to explain, I didn't know that you were a police officer. I think she came over. She was the one actually that came over and asked my name. So she came over and asked, and I said the same thing I maybe had said to the nurse. So maybe she did come over after I told the nurse. And they basically checked records with Central Washington Hospital. And they already were working with people from Central, so it was kind of set up. So then my son and I are in this waiting room, and she's saying that we have to wait there, and she's going to check on what to do with us and where to put us. And at that point, I felt forced to then say I was requesting political asylum, because that was the entire reason why I gave a different name. And rather than go to jail for committing a crime I hadn't even thought I was committing, and certainly didn't know that she was an officer, and I wasn't trying to lie to her, I declared right then and there on the spot, I'm declaring political asylum, and I have a right to political asylum. And that's why I gave that other name. So I was not committing a crime. And that woman did not like me right from the start. She hated me. I could tell that she was glad to have some reason to try to throw me in jail. I believe that the migraine was triggered because somebody knew that she was going to be there. So she was definitely working with whoever had just assaulted me and my son. And then I had to go back to my car for whatever reason, and she was taking us, and I was in the police car. And here's that same man who was outside of the women's shelter following us. And he winked and nodded off to her. I mean, this guy looks like a villain in a van. And had no business being outside of the shelter. He kind of looked like a thug. And then he was laughing at me and sarcastically mocking me, and then smiling like, yes, like they got it, like they got me with this police officer. And my whole intuitive feeling was he was in no way connected to the police. And she was an officer, but she very clearly demonstrated that she knew that man. So I have no doubt at all that she and that man knew each other. It wasn't like a friendly, casual passing by someone and being courteous and polite and nodding or waving. They were very obviously knew each other. And at that point I thought, I was scared. And so I got my records, and then I believe that she said to follow her to some place in my car with my son. So I did, and we ended up at the immigration department for Penticton, Canada. And I should also mention that when I was in the women's shelter, there was a woman who was a social worker that showed up there. So the first night, the next day after the first night that my son and I were there, there was a social worker coming in and asking us a lot of questions. And I knew if she's a social worker, they asked her to come in and check to see how we're doing. And I thought, why does anyone assume that we need a social worker to look in on me and my son? But this woman who had blonde hair, I could tell that as she was looking at me and my son, she saw that my son was very happy with me and that I was a good mother. I knew that she there's no possible way she found anything wrong with or odd about my parenting.